Hello everyone and welcome to the round glass review for the Olympus G Zuiko Auto-W 28mm f3.5. Olympus introduced this lens in 1972 and typical uses will include architecture, landscapes, general use, and travel photography. For your bottom line up front, there's a notion that 28mm f3.5 lenses are a compromise versus a 2.8 or f2. The 3.5 lenses have some advantages, however, over their faster brethren. Generally, these lenses are smaller and lighter, but they still deliver optically very well. This lens holds up well as its own offering in the reduced weight and size versus the other Olympus 28mm lenses of the time, as well as the much lower cost today. Means it can be a solid option for the photographer conscientious of lens size, weight, and cost. Your focal length and AOV are 28mm and 75.4 degrees on full frame, 42mm and 54.5 degrees on APS-C. The aperture range is 3.5 to 16. Element and group count are 7 and 7. Design type retro focus. Filter size 49mm. Closest focus is 0.3 meters, which in the US is 3 stalactite millennia. The drive type is manual focus only. Native mount is the film-era Olympus OM. Dimensions are 59 by 31 millimeters, and the weight is a very light 180 grams. You probably know what my first tip is if you're a mirrorless shooter. Pick up a macro adapter. This lens is sharp when focused beyond the designed focus point. That's the minimum focus point. And it's sharp beyond that point to just a hair before the maximum macro adapter focus rack on my OM to Sony E macro adapter. At the maximum focus rack, it does exhibit a bit of softness that stems from the lens's projected image getting to a point where the maximum sharpness has exceeded, or I should say, let me word this better, where the ability of the lens to perform sharply has been exceeded. In a nutshell, if a hypothetical lens projects sharpness at, let's say, 100 line pairs per millimeter, and that's at infinity focus, and 50 line pairs per millimeter, at the closest focus, that's what the lens can do in lens, then it might only deliver 25 line pairs per millimeter at macro focus lengths. That hypothetical 25 line pair per millimeter sharpness is likely to be soft enough that it becomes noticeable on images. Now, those numbers are just hypothetical for concept demonstration. The point of that is that this lens, when used on a macro adapter, reaches a focus point which is beyond its ability to render images in the sharpest manner that it can. That said, this lens is stunning for use with a macro adapter, and it provides a great deal of magnification and it allows for very close photos. So this lens works well on a macro adapter to a point, and then it becomes a bit soft. Now that said, the results can still be quite pleasing for the right subject. For my next tip, the subjects I found this lens worked best with were landscapes and other nature shots, especially up-close nature shots. Even without the macro adapter, this lens is highly usable for nature photography. That said, the best photography type that I would suggest for this lens is the travel genre. As a lens to take with you, it's tiny and light and ideal for carrying in a pocket. Even with the mirrorless adapter, it's not too large. Also, the hyperfocal distance of 0.7 meters to infinity at f16 is highly useful for a travel photographer looking to set the lens for quick photos. Lastly, for the APS-C and Micro Four Thirds mirrorless users, this is a good standard-ish lens, but frankly a bit slow. For those of you on that format, I would not recommend a macro adapter as the crop on those smaller formats will exacerbate the macro range softness from this lens. Looking at the dots test chart, we can see that this lens gets a bit soft and smeary toward the corners. If we go to 100% in the very middle, the dots show pretty decent performance over the central half of the image. The entire photo is 7,008 pixels wide, and this center 100% crop is 3,840 pixels wide, an area slightly smaller than APS-C. The dots nearest the edge of this 100% crop show good performance, which is good news for those of you who shoot smaller than full-frame sensors. If we jump to a 100% crop in the top left corner, the lens begins to exhibit a mix of chroma and sagittal astigmatism smearing. a performance that is typical of retrofocus lens designs of the late 60s through the end of the 70s. This lens does display this performance characteristic quite strongly and in a uniform manner around the image peripheries. Taking a look at the bokeh ball's test shots here, first at infinity focus and then at the closest focus, we see that the blurry area source point lights deliver a consistent performance with both focus settings, and spherical aberration is also highly well corrected in both images. We saw this diagram late last year when we ranked this lens against the other 28mm f3.5 OEM lenses of the time. Ultimately, this lens fared poorly in that comparison owing to a generally middle-of-the-road performance against the competition in a manufactured testing environment. However, for image results, this is a lens I absolutely love. The optical design here delivers lovely image rendition that captures subjects with colors and contrast that are truly flattering. Breathing is noticeable and, to my eye, amplified slightly by the f3.5 maximum aperture because at that aperture, a lot of the world is in focus. In fact, if you use the focusing scales and set infinity focus on the lens to the 3.5 mark on the focusing scales, then everything from 3 meters to infinity is in focus. That level of sharpness makes the blur around the subjects in these tests lower, and that will highlight how much the magnification changes. The aperture is stepped in full step increments. If you wanted to modify your OM to your mount adapter to prevent the aperture linkage from being pressed when the lens is mounted, however, you could use the DOF preview button on this lens as a way to make this lens function like a preset lens with smooth aperture control for in-shot aperture changes. The front element is non-rotating but does move in and out 3.5 millimeters, which is slightly more than 12% of the lens focal length. Focus throw is 80 degrees with a stationary focusing ring. Focus damping is nice for manual focusing and with a pleasant resistance that holds the lens focus in place. The autofocus effect on audio is not applicable, as this is a manual focus lens, and the focus action is quite quiet, though the lens has a click sound at each end's hard stop. Sharpness is quite good within the limits of the lens's designed focus range and for some distance beyond too. The lens does exhibit some astigmatism when focused close, especially using a macro adapter, and that can sap some of the apparent sharpness near the image periphery. Build quality, in line with early 70s OEM lenses, is great. The rubber grips on these have generally held up very well too. Contrast is quite pleasant, with the contrast facilitating nice image sharpness and color rendition, both of which hold up well on digital. Aperture stars are uninspiring, with stars forming at f5.6 and peaking at f16, though at no point would I describe them as class-leading. In fact, the stars this lens produces are a bit smeary, except in the red channel. Out-of-focus areas when focused very close and wide open can be nice. The out-of-focus areas change quite a bit when the lens stops down and they take on the shape of the aperture, which, especially with a busy background, makes them look a bit jumbled. Distortion is noticeable on the sides and top, fairly muted on the bottom, though there could be some mispositioning of the camera on my part. Light loss is quite substantial wide open and gets better to f11. At f16, a bit of light loss returns. Flare is hard to detect but present in harsh light, and it creates an overall contrast-reducing veil that can exhibit some color rainbows too. Ghosting is quite pronounced in some lighting conditions, even with the original OEM lens hood. Ghosts take on the aperture shape and are highly distracting. In some settings, a secondary reflection that looks either like a partial circle or a cone can manifest, and it appears to be some internal reflection, potentially from the rearmost element, which appears to not have been circumference painted. Balance with cameras is pleasant across the camera size spectrum owing to the overall size and weight of this lens. The Olympus G Zuiko Auto-W 28mm f3.5, let's face it, makes some compromises. The aperture stars are lackluster, the ghosting can be quite strong, and it could benefit from a little more focus throw. But what this lens offers in exchange for those trade-offs is a tiny lens that is highly pocketable and that delivers lovely contrast in colors with the ability to capture most scenes well. For the photographer on a budget, this is an option worth looking at very closely. In the 28mm f3.5 showdown last year, the Olympus Zuiko 28mm f3.5 placed 5th out of 6, which showed that from a technical perspective, this lens was not on the same plane as comparable lenses of the time. However, I like this lens the most of all 6. Why? The images it creates are stunning and captivating. Good images, as this video series has, I think, shown time and time again, do not live in the world of technical perfection. Good images live in the world of the photographer's creative vision paired with an ability to use a lens creatively and within its technical limitations. Yes, this lens has some shortcomings, but overall, it remains a favorite in this class of optics and could easily become a go-to favorite for any manual focus enthusiast.